Well, welcome to our ocean studio here in the beautiful Caribbean Sea. We're live streaming to you today from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it is a pleasure to share one of the great songs of the best, most accomplished, easily the most acclaimed songwriter of all time. And he's not a Beatle. He is, in fact, a Yehud. His name is Dode David. We're going to begin this portion of the YAHOWAH blog, and I am your host, Craig Winn, picking up where we left off in our last program on a book that I wrote called Coming Home. It is the first of 4 volumes, 3 of which are published and free at YADAYAH.com if you'd like to follow along. The first volume is called Call a Voice, and I am the voice bringing you the majesty of the greatest man who ever lived. In fact, as we begin this psalm, it probably is worth noting that Dode David is the greatest man, the most interesting man, the most acclaimed man who ever lived. He is not only the author of most of the Mizmor Psalms, most all of the Mashal Proverbs. He was the uniting king of Israel, who established Jerusalem as the capital 3,000 years ago. The city of Dode sits as an essential part of Yehudah in Jerusalem on the lower part of the ridge line that forms Zion, the signposts mounted along the way, which go up that ridge line to the threshing floor that was purchased by Dode on the top of Mount Moriah means to revere Yah, where his son, based upon all of the possessions that Dode had accumulated, built the home for Yahweh's name, known today as the First Temple. It is this man who wrote this song, and while all of those things are exceptional, and the fact is that he was a great prophet, and Dode also fought 66 defensive battles to protect his people and won them all. And you would say, well, the fact that he was anointed 3 times at Yahweh's insistence as the Messiah, and the fact that he was called on 3 occasions the Son of God by God himself, and called Yahweh's chosen one, the most set apart and special of all Israel. Well, one would think that that would make a rather robust resume and more than enough to make him the most acclaimed of men who ever lived. But that's only the beginning of it. You see, Dode David is a man with 3 lives. He returned, per his request, 1,000 years after he breathed his last in his first life, to fulfill Pesach, Matzah, and Bakodim, sacrifices which he volunteered to enable, based upon all that he had come to know and love about his Father, Yahweh. It is the greatest discovery in human existence, and yet it has always been plainly stated, right out in the open, that Dode accomplished this for us. His 22nd Mizmor is an eyewitness prophetic account of exactly what he would endure, being crucified by Rome as the Passover lamb, centuries before crucifixion was invented or Rome even existed. The same is true of his 88th Mizmor, also written in first person. And it is also true of what Yashayah, the great prophet Isaiah, wrote of him, which is now memorialized for us in the great Isaiah scroll, that Dode would be the very Lamb of God that would bear our guilt, carried it into Sheol so that we might appear perfect before our Father. after he opened the door to life by fulfilling Passover. And that is the second of, yes, 3 lives, because Dowd is going to return at Yahweh's insistence. And upon his return, the Messiah will be king of the universe, and not for a little while, but for all time. So when this man writes a song, its lyrics are important for us to understand, and that is why I'm sharing this series with you from the 3 volumes that have been published thus far of Coming Home. We are right now being sharing this stage with my 2 puppies, so we're hopeful that they don't knock over the microphone or anything in the process. I think they're out of camera sight. We'll begin. This is the introduction to this psalm. We do not have the introduction itself as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so all we really have in this particular case is the psalm itself. But I'm going to share the introduction with you, and we'll talk a little bit about this man that is part of the introduction to the 3rd psalm. It is a mizmor, a song, whereby there are lyrics set to music of Dowd. He is the beloved, and Dowd is the correct pronunciation of his name. It is not David. There is no second vowel in his name, just one, the Wah. And the Wah is definitely not a V. It makes the O sound in Hebrew. So the man's name is Dowd. He wrote it himself. I think he knew how to spell his name. And so we can be rather confident that the author of this mizmor song and its lyrics are Dowd, the beloved of Yahweh. In fact, it is Dowd's name that you find in Yahud, the very word that is rendered as Jew, Yahud, and Yahudim in the plural. It means Yahweh's beloved, and is a compound of Yahweh and Dowd. And in this introduction, it reads, upon his fleeing. And I don't think there is any chance that this was actually written as the introduction to the mizmor by Dowd. And the reason is he very often began his psalms by saying this is a mizmor or song of Dowd. But then he never slipped into 3rd person, because he writes his psalms in 1st person. And this says upon his fleeing. And the fact is that Dowd's not going to be celebrating that great blemish on his life and character. And he's never going to be referencing it in 3rd person. So it is from the presence, it reads here, from the presence of Absalom, his son. And Absalom was Dowd's son, but again, he is not going to call him his son. He is going to call him my son if he wishes to speak of him. Anyway, this is now presented as an introduction to this psalm, and it is interesting for us to consider why it was placed here, but it was likely added by the Masoretes. And they foolishly vocalized a text that already had 5 vowels amongst the 22 letters in the 11th century CE. Anyway, the episode the Masoretic text introduction references was symbolic of the broken family of man. Dowd's household was torn apart, and in the worst possible way, just has been the case with Israel violating every aspect of the covenant. And it's all reflected in the fallen state of familial relations that father and son sought to rectify. This is the whole purpose of Pesach Matzah Bakurim, is to resolve this split between Yahweh and his covenant family, which was to be comprised mostly of Israelites. Chag matzah serves this purpose. And it is ultimately resolved on Yom Kippurim, the Day of Reconciliations. So now that we have this introduction, even if it was written by the Masoretes, let's take a moment and consider what occurred circa 1000 BCE. Absalom, meaning the father reconciles, was the third of 6 sons born to Dod in Hebron. Absalom's mother was Maacah, the third of 4 wives chosen by Dod in this same place. His wife Maacah was the daughter of Talmai, who was the king of Geshur. Regrettably, Dod's daughter Tamar, who was Absalom's sister, was raped by Amnon, Dod's firstborn son. For reasons we may never know, Dod did not intervene and hold his son accountable, at least based upon the records that we have dating to that time. With this evil act unchecked, Tamar sought revenge with Absalom. And as their rage over what had occurred welled up within them, after 2 years' time, Absalom sought to avenge his sister's rape, sending his servants to murder a drunken Amnon during a feast. So they killed Dod's wayward firstborn son for what he had done. Immediately thereafter, Absalom fled to his maternal grandmother, the aforementioned king of Geshur. I should say grandfather. He was the king of Geshur. 3 years later, Dod married again. And the fact he's not a perfect man doesn't change the fact he is still the greatest man who ever lived. He's very real. And with Dod, we see the highs and the lows, the sparkling diamond, and actually the boils as well. He is presented for us to know the full extent of this man's rich character. And so 3 years after all of this, Dod forgave his son, Absalom, for killing his firstborn. And so he returned to Jerusalem. Now listen, none of this is acceptable. I mean, you don't wrong a right by making another wrong. But while there, Absalom, of course, flattered and appeased everyone, saying, "If only I were the Shabat, judge of the land, you would have everything you wanted," thereby appealing to the selfish nature of many. After 4 years of being subversive and duplicitous, Absalom declared himself king. He even slept with his father's concubines. Having played the role of a modern politician to perfection, and by offering the people what was not theirs to take or his to give, many flocked to him, leaving Dod somewhat vulnerable and isolated. Now, upon hearing of the coup and subsequently infiltrating his son's court, Dod took his time committing his troops to battle. But finally, he had his nephew, Joab, his most valiant and, heroic, disciplined, really wise commander, confront his son. And the usurpers aligned with him in the woods of Ephraim, where they would rout Absalom. You know, one of the reasons that I'm telling this story to you, even if this Masoretic introduction to the Mizmor was contrived, is because Absalom's coup, his rebellion against the one man at this time Yahweh had inspired to speak for him, was not contrived. Absalom did lead a contentious rebellion against Yahweh's chosen one, Dowd. It is prophetic in a way, and also a harbinger of something that happened previously when Moshe's own family, his brother and his sister, Aaron and Miriam, confronted him, tried to undermine him with his chosen bride, and then said, "We also speak for God." It was a rebellion that Yahweh himself had to put down, because not everyone speaks for God. When someone speaks for God, they know it, and you know it, or at least should. Same thing was true with Dowd. And now, 3,000 years after this rebellion took place, we have another affirmation of the same thing. As Yahweh has many hundreds of prophecies explaining how he's going to speak through me. I am the cold voice in this matter. Dowd's herald, reacquainting God's people not only with Yahweh's name, but with his son's exploits as never before. And I have faced the exact same kind of challenge. And so there are lots of times where Yahweh reminds us that all who have spoken for him and have served in this unique way have undergone the same kind of challenges, and that ultimately they have to be resolved appropriately. In Miriam's and Aaron's case challenging Moshe, Yahweh resolved it resolutely. In the case of Dowd with Absalom, we're going to find out that Dowd did not handle it well. He did not turn to Yahweh for resolution. And as a result, it was handled very poorly. In my case, I turned to Yahweh for advice as to how to handle this. He directed me to his Torah. And we have and will continue to do exactly as Yahweh instructs. Well, anyway, as we return to this particular coup, there was a battle in the woods of Ephraim. And as Dowd's overly ambitious son retreated, riding, of course, an ass, a pared, meaning to break apart and separate, Absalom's hair was caught in the glorified Allah. It was a Gado Allah, or a mighty oak tree. I thought that is also delicious in terms of harbingers of things to come. Now, with Allah being glorified by those who would rebel not only against Dowd and against Yahweh's chosen implement, but against all of Yisrael. And this is the form of Allah that was usurped by Muhammad and Muslims to become the name of their wannabe God. Now, his predicament was reported to Joab. Joab means Yahweh is our father. And as Dowd's commander, whom Absalom had previously insulted and sought to intimidate by setting his fields ablaze, Joab called to this location where Absalom was hanging by his hair from an Allah, an oak tree. Joab killed Absalom. 3 darts, right to the heart, even though Dowd had given explicit instructions that no one was to harm his son. Sometimes you have to do what's right, even if those who are in authority don't know it. Upon the news of his death, Dowd went up to the second-story room over the doorway and wept. And as he walked about and carried on like this, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, if I could, I would have given my life for you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Shamuel, he listens to God, 2 Samuel 18:33. serves to foreshadow Dowd offering his life on Passover and his soul during Matzah as Ab Shalom, as the Father's means to reconciliation. And so while it was very sad when uttered for the son who had gone rogue, it was again prophetic of the Father's Son who would reconcile the relationship with his people. The moment I came to realize that Dowd had volunteered to serve as the Passover lamb and as the soul fulfilling matzah, it became rather obvious that he would ask this of his father. Yes, Dowd made his sacrifice to save Israel and to earn the covenant family's respect so that he could lead them effectively for all time. But I'm convinced he also did, not to save, as I had once thought, but to spare the soul of the son he still loved. Dowd knew that he was partially responsible for Absalom's rebellion and would make amends. It is demonstrative of Father's love for his son and the length he would go to reconcile his relationship with him. But in this case, what I think Yahowah was probably willing to do, considering the extent of Absalom's rebellion against his beloved son Dowd, is that he probably spared Absalom from an eternity in Sheol, which is a major concession by Yahowah to his son, Dowd. Joab's speech to Dowd that day is worth considering. I have had it falsely wielded against me by the retrobates that decided to form a mother god cult and attack me in the process. So I know this speech quite well. In setting the scene, we read, "The victory that day was turned to mourning for all of the people, for the family heard it said that the king," that would be Dowd, "was grieved for his son. The king covered his face and he shrieked with a loud voice, 'O my son Absalom, my son, my son.'" So this is continuing to be cited from the judge turned prophet Shamuel. Dowd was inspired and blessed beyond any other man, and so I understand that he grieved for his son. And it is in this way that he represents the purpose of the Word of God and the Torah, which is to enlighten and to perfect the imperfect. He also represents Israel, God's chosen and wayward children. But most of all, he represents the Father who wants to spare his children, to protect them from harm's way. With Dowd, especially when addressed by Joab, Yahowah is also the Father, such that we realize that not only who we are, but what is possible when we align ourselves with the Father who became the Father's Son. So while the voice is Joab's, the inspiration behind every word of this is the Father whom Joab, Yah is the Father, was named. I am certain that Yahowah himself inspired this speech. Then Joab, Yah is the Father, arrived at the home of the king, put about down the ridge line of Zion, still on Mount Moriah. And he declared, "You have become emaciated, withering away, confused, and disappointing this day in the presence of your coworkers. It is true. And this part of the story is worth telling because it has ramifications really on all of us. Dode ultimately withered under the pressure. It had to be enormous. He had been chosen by Yahweh, anointed by Yahweh at 8 years old. In his first public act, he brought down the most menacing of the Philistines, today's people that are mocking us under the Palestinian title have, of course, no relationship to these people, but it is humorous that they chose this name because Philistine means foreign invader. They came actually from Crete. They were menacing the Jews back then. They were essentially terrorists. They hailed, of course, from Gaza. And they Dode with a single stone established the prostration prayer that the Muslims would follow. Old Goliath did a face plant, butt up, right there in front of Dode. And he went on to turning from a hero of his people for defending them against the Philistines to being the feared rival of the king that the people had chosen. Yahweh chose Dode, the people chose Shaul. Shaul and Dode's rivalry mirrored the rivalry between Israel and the church that another Benjamite, Shaul, now known as Paul, conceived in foisting a false Messiah on the world in Jesus Christ. Paul is the author and inspiration behind most all of the Christian New Testament. His letters were the first written, and the first two of the so-called Gospels were written under Paul's edict and inspiration to provide some context for the myth that he had perpetrated in his 14 letters. So it's all a harbinger, a prophecy, if you will, for what was to come. And Dode was hounded by Shaul, who sought to kill him, just as Paul, the next Shaul, ultimately destroyed the acclaim and attributes of Dode to rob him of them, bury Dode, and then proclaim that his mythical misnomer, his counterfeit, was the Messiah and Son of God. So all of this fits into this, and Dode was hounded for years on the run, trying to spare his life from this man who would kill him. And he then ultimately, upon Saul's death at the hands of the Philistines, and at that time God had completely disassociated from Shaul and damned him, essentially. At this time, Dode, upon his death of his rival, becomes king. And it is a highly tumultuous experience. I mean, imagine a man defending with his bare hands. I mean, Dode always led from the front. He was a courageous man, an ultimate Gabor. He fought 66 battles, wielding the sword himself to defend God's people. And then the thanks he got for all of that was his own son led this coup against him. It ultimately wore Dode down. And he went from the great prophet and songwriter and to a man who was a shadow of his former self. And what this tells us is that the job that Yahweh wants us to fulfill, wanted his chosen one, Dode, to fulfill, very much like the job he wanted Moshe to fulfill. Moshe had similar challenges. Jews have been irascible for a long time. It's a very difficult group of people to leave. In fact, essentially impossible. And Moshe finally wore out and stopped listening to Yahweh and went and struck the crag, and as opposed to speaking to it, and had to be retired. Dode wore out too. And I know this quite well because for the last 23 years, I've worked anywhere from 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week for all of that time, writing the books that, I guess they're on the bookshelf out of camera range here, but you can find them at yadayah.com, the 35 books on the shelf there. All with innovative translations, all filled with thousands of unique insights. And then one day, Yahweh just said, "You've written enough books. I want you to start the Yahowah blog. I want you to look into a camera. I want you to speak directly to my people. It's time you tell them what you know." And I can tell you, this is well, I'm happy to do as Yahweh asks, and I enjoy doing what Yahweh asks. This is exceedingly taxing in the sense of, by the end of a day of live streaming, where it's just me and you, pouring this out of myself and what I have come to know to you, to reacquaint you with Yahweh and his beloved Son and his Son's achievements, knowing how irascible you are, how difficult it is to get your attention, how most of you are defiant as opposed to accepting, how I'll go later in the day on X where we're live streaming this, and there may be 50 of you who have listened, 50 among 15 million Jews. You're a tough audience. And Dode knew it. And you ultimately just wore him down. Now, Yahweh has placed his 7 spirits inside of me to embolden me, to enable me, to enlighten me, so that I can share this message with you. But yet, while the Spirit is divine, I'm a mortal man. And I understand, you can even hear it in my voice from time to time, how wearisome it becomes trying to get the attention of Yehudim and Israelites. You're the roughest audience, probably in the history of humankind, particularly when it comes to the Word of God. So going back to this statement, I want to read it from the beginning. You have become emaciated, withering away, confused and disappointing on this day. Yes. Not only can it happen to the best of us, it did happen to the best of us. Confused and disappointing this day in the presence of your coworkers, all of whom would have saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives, even the lives of your concubines. Samuel, listen to him, 2 Samuel 19:5. But you have come to love those you hate, and you hate those you should love. You have implied this day that you don't have leaders or co-workers. I realize that if Absalom had lived and all of the rest of us had died this day, then it would have been seen by you as pleasing and correct. I recognize that this man was a relative of Dode. He was a man who served Dode, and yet he had to correct him. It is a role that I will and have already played. It's a tough role because we respect this man more than any other for what he has done for us. But yet, even Yahweh will challenge his beloved when his beloved needs to be corrected. I've heard him say it to me. I recall one day where I was asking what was going to happen to my beloved fur faces when we were harvested as part of the two upcoming harvests, Shabat and Towrah. And Yahweh's retort was, "So where do you think you're going?" Which turned out to be one of the most insightful lines God has shared with me. And one day when I said, I really don't want to have to go back and rewrite Prophet of Doom, that was a terrible experience, wallowing in the miserable, perverted, disgusting, Jew-hating, genocidal life of Muhammad and the demonic texts of Allah, his wannabe God. And I said, I've rewritten all these other books multiple times, some 8, 10, 12 times. I know I have never rewritten Prophet of Doom in all of these years, and I know that now after 10/7 of 23, it needs to be done, but I really don't want to have to do it. And Yahweh's answer was immediate and bold. It was, I have taken care of you. Now you take care of my people. When there's a job to do, and Yahweh picks someone to do it, he expects us to respond and to do that job. And in this case, Dode failed. In other cases, he succeeded mightily. So this is Joab continuing to speak to him. He says, so right now, stand up and choose to go out and speak from the heart to your co-workers, because I promise by Yahweh, if you do not go forth, if you remain an obstinate and immobilized individual, this night will be worse for you than all of the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. Shamuel, listen to him, 2 Samuel 19, 6 and 7. Whoa, that's tough love. And he was speaking from Yahweh. He needed a kick in the behind, and he needed it now. And it is also one of the great lessons that Yahweh teaches us. I had this same leprous Goyim Motherite cult also had one of its leaders throw this in my face, saying, you have a broken family. Yeah, so does Yahweh. So did Dode. So did Moshe. It goes with the territory. And in this case, it is essential to know that when you have a broken family, you need to turn to Yahweh's covenant family, because it is the only resolution for it. And if you stay instead and wallow over your broken earthly family, of which 99.99% of them are shattered in one way or another, or in multiple ways, then your life will be worth nothing. At the end of it, you will have accomplished nothing. At the end of it, you will have no affiliation with the covenant, which is the resolution for all of this, until you have experienced what Dode experienced and overcome it, which he was on the cusp of doing, until you experience what Moshe experienced and overcome it, until you experience what I've experienced and rise above it. Then you do not have the empathy needed to understand Yahweh's point of view when addressing his wayward and irascible children, Yisrael. Now, there is a reason that Yahweh asked Hosea, through whom he proclaimed the divorce amongst his people, saying, you are no longer my children. He asked Hosea to marry a temple prostitute, to understand what unfaithful is all about. Because the Jewish people, the Israelites, have always preferred being religious to the relationship Yahweh intended. And it is utter betrayal of God. So this is an absolute essential insight into the very nature of the fallen family of man, and why Yahweh, as a prerequisite for being a member of his covenant, says that you must walk away from your father's home, from the family of man. It's a prerequisite to be part of his family. We're not bringing this broken and shattered world into eternity, into heaven. Well, Dode was partially right to grieve for his son, although I'm sorry, when I've had and faced rebellion internally in my family, I have not grieved for them. I realize that I have a responsibility, and to grieve over something that you've lost is a waste of time. Learn from it, bear the scars of it, develop some backbone by having risen above it, and then go on and achieve something that's worthwhile for others. Depression occurs when we wallow in our own microcosm of familial pain. We don't have the world exactly as we want our family to be, and so we get all depressed and we wallow in it and we become useless to everyone, including that very family. And Yahowah's advice here is get over it. You have coworkers, you have a job, you have a responsibility. Develop a backbone on a stem in Hebrew. Actually be a gabor, for which you have been and will be. Man up. Start focusing on what you can do for others, and particularly the covenant family, particularly for Yisrael, which you can accomplish with Yahowah. And the depression is gone. Life has meaning. Your very existence has value. Every moment is an opportunity to do something wonderful. That was the challenge that was being given to Dode. Stop grieving and get going. Start celebrating the relationship that matters. Now that you have this internal hurt that provides empathy so that you can speak for the heart. You know, there's a reason that Yahowah asked me to stop writing and to stop speaking, to start speaking. Because when I write, I can't convey the passion. I can't be vulnerable. I can't communicate this same level of commitment and credibility that is possible when you can look in my eyes, when you can see my expression, when you can hear the tone of my voice. You know that I come from a place of great conviction and confidence. And that conviction and confidence is not won by having everything being daffodils and glitter. It's not all rainbows out there. Life is tough. We humans have made a mess of it. And it's getting tougher and tougher every day for Jews. Confidence comes from having risen above challenges, for having pushed those obstacles aside, for having once fallen, standing back up again. This is how we become useful, not only to God, but to our fellow man. And it was time that Yahowah hold him, his son, accountable for what he had done. Just as our father stood up for us, Dode would have to take a stand on behalf of his people. Yeah, in particular, Absalom. He was guilty of sin. Now, in the case of Chag Matzah, Chag Matzah can go a long way to resolving our guilt. It can't go so far as to resolve what Absalom had done. But nonetheless, it was likely enough, and Dode's fulfillment of Chag Matzah and ultimate fulfillment of Kippurim will be enough to keep Absalom's soul out of Sheol. Dowd should have hated what Absalom had done, and he should have stopped loving him as a rebellious son. But Dowd couldn't stop loving his son. And maybe it was just projected guilt, where Dowd knows that he should have resolved the issue of, well, he should have done a better job of raising his firstborn so that his firstborn didn't rape his daughter. And then when he did, he should have held his firstborn accountable. And none of this would have occurred, and Dowd knew it. And the guilt that Dowd felt here, and the fact that he responded so poorly, Dowd knew the only way to recover from this, the only way to have credibility again, was that he himself would volunteer to fulfill Chag Matzah. Now, if we can view all of this from the perspective intended by the dedication, whether it was projected on this mizmor or not, and if so, and if not, nonetheless, we have been enriched by the knowledge of what occurred, by the fact that we recognize that most all of Yahweh's prophets, witnesses, messengers have experienced the same thing in life, so that we're in a position to have the conviction and character to stand up and be accountable. And Yahweh asked me to expose and condemn Islam. I'm going to tell you that takes some character. No one has done what I have done and lived to never survived it. And I did so under my own name. That's why I'm bringing you these programs under my own name. I'm not hiding from anyone. That's why I moved the studio outdoors, so you know that I'm not hunkered down someplace. I'm out for all to see. I'm afraid of no one. I serve Yahweh. And so we all should be enriched by Yoav's affirmation that it is ungodly for any of us to love what we ought to hate and to hate what we ought to love, while recognizing that it is all prophetic of Dowd's ultimate resolution, which was for himself to fulfill Pesach, Matzah, and Bekurim. This now is the opening line of the third mizmor. Quite an introduction, isn't it? But and if you're a veteran of the YAHOWAH blog, now that we have produced well over 100 hours in this video library, you know that we love everything associated with Yahweh. And every detail, every facet of this relationship, every insight we can provide is a treasure and helps build the foundation upon which understanding is possible. Gives you the proper perspective to know who I am, who Dowd is, who Yahweh is, and who you are, particularly if you are a Israelite or Yehudim. Yahweh, now that's a name that many of you reject. It's a name that your religious leaders erased, robbed you of, removed it from your lives, even though your very name, Yahud, is a compound of Yahweh and Dowd, meaning Yahweh's beloved. Yahweh is God's one and only name. He explained it quite clearly to Moshe. It is in the midst of the Torah. For someone to claim that they're Torah observant and not to proclaim Yahweh's name means that they are a liar, which would include all rabbis, all Haredim, all Orthodox, and even Reformed Jews. Yahweh is an accurate transliteration of the name of Eloah, God, guided by his Torah, instructions regarding his Haya existence and our Shalom reconciliation. All of these words, which are readily pronounced in Hebrew, tell us exactly how to pronounce Yahweh's name. It is irrefutable. So the question begins, Yahweh, what is the extent and why the increasing number, Rabab, who are the most concerning? How many are there, and to what purpose is the mass gathering and magnitude of my adversaries and troubles, Sar Ani, of my foes and unfavorable situation, of my enemies and would-be oppressors, of my dire straits and narrow confines, even opponents who are lowly and little, from Sha'ar, to be bound and confined in a narrow place, besieged, tied up, and vexed. A great many rob, the preponderance of the people, a majority, an abundant and extensive amount, rise up. They take a stand and are established. They're honored. They're even exalted. They're incited. They're empowered against me. Al-Ani, Mizmor lyrics to be sung, Psalm 3:1. Well, that's the answer. The reason that the story of Absalom was put as an introduction to this psalm by the Masoretes 1,100 years after it was written is because they were looking to explain what Dode was talking about, and they had no clue that it wasn't historic, but was instead prophetic. If you listen to the previous program that I did in Coming Home 1, you'll know that I specifically stated that it is unlikely that the introduction mentioning Absalom, preceded the third Mizmor, because of the fact that the third Mizmor was early in Dode's life, not late in Dode's life, and the Absalom rebellion was late in Dode's life. So the Masoretes are looking at this and said, wait a minute, he's got this huge uprising. The most empowered people on earth, are Dode's adversaries. So we need an explanation, and this is the best one we've got. But it doesn't fit. Not only doesn't fit in terms of timing, the people who were rising against him weren't the most powerful, and they weren't all that particularly numerous. Most people continued to side with Dode. And Dode would never ask the question, what's the extent of this? When he knew it was his own son's uprising. He would never have asked this question. And so this whole thing doesn't pertain to that. Let me tell you what it pertains to. Dode ultimately volunteered, as we have begun to put together the pieces from the first two Moed Mizmor, to fulfill Pesach, Matzah, and Makodim on behalf of his people. And the sacrifice, while exceedingly painful and courageous for Dode to make, wasn't the most difficult part. The biggest challenge was that Dode realized that the vast majority of his people would deny what he had done, and that his very people would foist a false Messiah to claim his attributes and to acclaim his achievements. Far more painful is to have made the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate expression of love, and to have your own people not only deny it, but ascribe a false Messiah to credit him for what you have done. And so Dode, as a prophet, has been taking forward in time, and he's saying that the entire world has turned against him and what he achieved. Let me explain this to you. Christianity is nothing more than a renunciation of Dode's titles, Son of God and Messiah, and Dode's title, Savior, Dode's title, Chosen One, Dode's title, Melech King, and ascribing all of this to a counterfeit named Iesu Christou, who later became known as Jesus Christ. That's all it is. It's robbing Dowd of what he did and creating a mythological individual to renounce all of Dowd's achievements and his titles and replace him with another, a myth. And it's the most popular religion in human existence, and it was founded by a rabbi, one named after Dowd's nemesis, Shaul. That's why Chabauk, 666 years before Paul wrote his first letter, condemns Shaul by name, calling him the plague of death, and details the most important aspects of this goddamn religion known as Christianity. They piled their religious rubbish right on top of what Dowd had achieved, hiding it from his own people, and it was his own people who were responsible for this, particularly the Benjamite Shaul known as Paul. So this is where we stand. And then his own people also created, within 100 years of that time, less than 100 years of that time, the religion of Judaism, Rabbi Akiva. Rather than destroying the myth of Christianity and say, no, that isn't an Iesu Christou. There is no Iesu Christou. There is no Christ. What you've done is simply counterfeit through replacement foolology all of the promises made to Dowd. He told us when he was going to arrive. The actual Messiah and Son of God came to fulfill Pesach, Matzah, and Bakodim, and you're just making a fool of yourself with this ridiculous New Testament of yours. Rather than doing that, he instead foisted another false Messiah, Bar Kokhba, from which you get your star, Israel, on the world. And that false Messiah brought the wrath of Rome and Hadrian upon Israel, Judea. It's what caused the renaming of Judea as Philistia. It is what caused the diaspora. It is what ultimately led to the Holocaust. And that's the founder of Rabbinic Judaism. And he is an overt enemy of Dowd. He is one that is restricting all of the knowledge of what Dowd has achieved. And it's the most prevalent religion among Dowd's people. And then there's Islam, which also demeans Dowd, turning him into a godforsaken Muslim, presenting what the Talmud has to say about Dowd. It's disgusting, really. And Muhammad to elicit the pledge of Aqaba from a bunch of pagans out of Yathrib, which was a Jewish town, pretended to be the Messiah himself. Something that the Jews, of course, in Yathrib mocked when he came into town. The second greatest, most popular religion amongst humankind also has a false Messiah. Between them, over 5 billion people, plus the majority of Yehudim. That is what Dowd is asking about. How in the world could this happen? Yahowah, what is the extent of? Why the increasing number of my adversaries and troubles, Sar? Of those foes who have placed me in this unfavorable situation, who have tried to confine what I represent. How many? How long will they rise up and take a stand against me? I know the answer. Do you? Yeah. The answer to that question is that they would continue to rise up and take a stand against everything Dowd represents until the very end. The last hurrah will be on Towrah in year 6000 Yah, which is September 24th of 2033, during the sacrifice of the Adamah Parah, known as the Red Heifer, orchestrated by Elia, the great orator against religion and politics. That's when it will all come to an end. And the person most responsible for reintroducing what Dowd has done and writing 13 volumes of the Yada Yahowah series against this great adversarial conspiracy against Dowd through goddamn religion, Twistianity, and Babel, has become Dowd's herald, the very cold voice of God at this time, answering this very question for you in this very moment as part of the YAHOWAH blog. We will return to Mizmor, lyrics to be sung, Psalm 3, in the next episode of our program on Coming Home, A Voice. I am Yada, your host, Craig Winn.